Hello everyone and welcome to our module on ovarian epithelial tumors. There are lots of different tumors that can occur in the ovary, but you can basically think of all the tumors in the ovary as deriving from one of three different ovarian structures. So you're aware that ovaries contain oocytes or eggs, and tumors that derive from these cells are called germ cell tumors, which I talk about in another video. There are then a number of different types of supporting cells like the theca and granulosa cells and the fibroblasts, and tumors from these cells are called sex cord stromal tumors. In this video, we're going to focus on tumors that derive from the surface epithelium. So the surface of the ovary contains an epithelial layer, and tumors that derive from this layer are called adenomas and carcinomas. The ovarian surface epithelium covers the outer surface of the ovary. It's made up of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. It is a single layer of cells. And we don't talk much about these cells outside of oncology because they don't play a major role in the physiology of the ovary, but they're very important in terms of tumors because they often lead to ovarian cancer. This epithelial layer is derived embryologically from the coelomic epithelium. This is the epithelial lining of an embryonic sac called the coelom. This is a space that gives rise to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It also forms the outer layer of male and female gonads. It also forms the lining of the body wall, the liver, lungs, and the GI tract. But for our purposes here, what you want to know is that this epithelium of the coelom is what gives rise to the ovarian surface epithelium. As we'll see in a minute, there are many different subtypes of ovarian epithelial cell tumors, but they all have similar clinical features. First of all, these types of ovarian tumors are often a silent disease. They usually aren't recognized until the very late stages, and unfortunately, we don't have good methods for screening for ovarian epithelial cell tumors. The classic presentation is an adnexal mass that's identified on pelvic exam or on imaging. Sometimes women have vague abdominal symptoms like bloating and early satiety or pelvic or abdominal pain, but often the tumors have no symptoms at all, and this is largely a disease of older women. The average age at diagnosis is 63 years old. Now, it's rare, but sometimes women present with acute symptoms related to an ovarian epithelial tumor, so these symptoms have an abrupt onset. This often happens in advanced disease, and it usually happens because the tumor is disrupting the function of an organ outside of the ovary. For example, some women present with bowel obstruction from local spread through the peritoneum, and the workup leads to discovery of an ovarian epithelial cell tumor. Other times, women can present with ascites or a pleural effusion. The pleural effusions are malignant pleural effusions from pleural metastasis, and there are cancer cells in the pleural fluid. And then finally, sometimes women present with a DVT or a pulmonary embolism, a venous thromboembolism. That's because these cancers represent a hypercoagulable state, and sometimes the first time the woman's aware she has the malignancy is when she develops a blood clot. So now we're going to talk about the various types of epithelial cell tumors. And the first thing to know generally about this class of ovarian tumors is that they are the most common type of ovarian tumors. You'll often hear people say that an elderly friend or family member has ovarian cancer, and this is the type of malignancy they're usually talking about. There are a couple of subtypes. The most common is called the serous subtype. It gets its name because they secrete serum or water, and the tumors are filled with watery substance. Second most common type is called mucinous. These secrete mucus. That's how they get their name. Next type is called endometrioid, and it gets its name because the cells look similar to endometrial cells and structures. And all of these tumor types can be either benign, malignant, or borderline. So what I mean by this is a woman may be discovered to have a mass in her ovary, and on biopsy, if she's lucky, she'll find out it's a benign version of one of these tumors, and if she's unlucky, she'll find out it's a malignant version. And the benign versions are called adenoma, and the malignant versions are called adenocarcinoma. Let's start by talking about the serous subtype. The benign version of the serous subtype is called a serous cyst adenoma. The malignant version is called a serous cyst adenocarcinoma. We'll talk about that next. So a serous cyst adenoma is a benign serous epithelial tumor of the ovary. These tumors are often bilateral, meaning they often occur in both ovaries at the same time. On gross specimen, they just look like a cyst filled with watery fluid. This is a picture of what one looks like on the screen here. Under the microscope, what you see is a thin wall of single cells lining the cyst. This is what it looks like here. So this is the inside of the cyst here, and there's this thin wall of cells lining the cyst. The malignant version of the serous tumors is called a cyst adenocarcinoma, and this is the most common malignant ovarian tumor overall. Remember, epithelial tumors of the ovary are the most common ovarian tumors, and the serous subtype is the most common subtype. So therefore, it makes sense that the malignant version of the serous subtype is the most common malignant ovarian tumor. On gross specimen, these tumors look like complex cysts with watery fluid. So instead of a nice, simple cyst like you would see for a benign tumor, what you see is a cyst with lots of bumps and irregular shape to it. There's growth of that epithelial layer we saw in the last slide. So instead of a nice single layer, you see lots of folding of the epithelial layer like shown on the screen here. And one thing to know about the tumor cells in a cyst adenocarcinoma is that they share many similarities with fallopian tube cells. And one of the theories of the origin of these types of ovarian cancers is that they derive from the fallopian tubes. Another feature that is sometimes seen in serous cyst adenocarcinomas is the presence of psammoma bodies. These are small circular areas of calcification. This is one shown on the screen here that comes from a meningioma. You can find psammoma bodies in a number of different tumor types, but one of the tumor types where they're sometimes seen is serous cyst adenocarcinomas. Moving on, let's talk about the mucinous subtype of the ovarian epithelial cell tumors. The benign version of the mucinous subtype is called a mucinous cyst adenoma. This consists of a thin-walled cyst that's filled with mucus. That's how it gets its name. These are often bigger than the serous tumors, and they're also often multiloculated, which means there are many small cavities and recesses inside the tumor that contain mucus. The malignant version of this subtype is called a cyst adenocarcinoma, and there's really nothing special about it. It's just a malignant variant of a cyst adenoma. A high-yield detail to remember about mucinous ovarian tumors is that they are associated with a condition called pseudomyxoma peritoniae. In this condition, basically the abdomen fills up with mucus and obstructs the bowels. So this happens anytime there's spread of a mucinous tumor to the abdomen. It results in ascites that consists of mucus called mucinous ascites, and basically when you open the abdomen in the operating room, what you see is a diffuse gelatinous material all over the abdomen and pelvis, and this can lead to bowel obstruction and even death. It's associated with mucinous epithelial tumors of the ovary. It's also often seen in appendix cancer. Cancer of the appendix is very rare, but when it does happen, that's the other classic condition associated with pseudomyxoma peritoniae. Moving on, we'll talk about endometrioid tumors. These tumors get their name because they contain tubular glands that are similar to the endometrium. So this is a drawing of what the endometrium looks like, and in an endometrioid tumor of the ovary, the tumor contains glands and stroma that look just like the endometrium. If you know that this tumor looks like the endometrium, then it's easy to remember that it often occurs in women who also have endometriosis, which I talk about in another video. And these types of epithelial cell tumors are one subtype that have a good prognosis. They're often identified at an earlier stage, and they're relatively sensitive to chemotherapy. Now, the main subtypes of epithelial tumors are the serous, mucinous, and endometrioid, but there are some more rare subtypes which you can read about in your textbooks. But one that I want to mention specifically is called a Brenner tumor. This is a rare subtype of epithelial tumor of the ovary, and what's special about it is that these tumors contain bladder epithelial cells, transitional cells of the bladder. These are usually benign tumors, and they're often discovered incidentally, so a woman has abdominal pain or some other reason for abdominal imaging, and it reveals an ovarian mass, and after the mass is removed, you discover that it's a Brenner's tumor, which luckily is usually benign. Under the microscope, what you see are these circular patches of cells, and when you zoom in on them, you see that they have a classic finding called coffee bean nuclei. That's what's shown on the right. You can see that these nuclei look like coffee beans, and that's one of the hallmarks of a Brenner tumor. So now that we've talked about the clinical features of epithelial cell tumors and the different subtypes, let's talk about the risk factors. And the idea here is that one of the theories of how epithelial cell tumors develop is that ovulation damages the epithelium, and over time, this leads to epithelial cell cancers. And the reason that's one of the theories is because more ovulation is associated with more risk of epithelial cell tumors. So for example, women who are at an advanced age have obviously ovulated more throughout their life, and they are at greater risk. Women who have menarche at an early age or menopause at a late age have had more ovulation, and they are at more risk. And women who have never been pregnant are also at more risk. There's a lower risk among women who have been pregnant because while women are pregnant, they do not ovulate. There's also a lower risk among women who breastfeed because during breastfeeding, women don't ovulate. And then finally, women who take oral contraceptive pills do not ovulate, and that also puts them in a lower risk group. Some other risk factors are shown on this slide. Women with a family history of ovarian cancer are at higher risk. If a woman is infertile due to any cause, she has a higher risk of epithelial cell cancer of the ovary. The polycystic ovarian syndrome and endometriosis both increase a woman's risk. And then finally, women who have had a tubal ligation to prevent pregnancy are at lower risk. This is protective. This is believed to be due to the fact that fallopian tube factors may lead to cancer, and this theory of the fallopian tubes being involved in epithelial cell tumors comes up again and again, and this is another place where that association plays a role. Women who've had their tubes ligated are at lower risk of epithelial cell cancers. Women who carry a mutation of the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene are also at increased risk for ovarian epithelial cell tumors. The BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes code for DNA repair proteins, and when they are mutated, they are associated with higher rates of breast and ovarian cancer. Now, most people remember that these genes are associated with breast cancer because the BRCA in the name stands for breast cancer. But what you also have to remember is that mutations of BRCA1 and BRCA2 are also associated with ovarian cancer. And these genes are especially common among Ashkenazi Jews. In a non-Jewish population in the US, mutations occur in 1 in 400 people. In an Ashkenazi Jewish population, mutations occur in 1 in 40 people. HNPCC is hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer. It's also called the Lynch syndrome. I talk about this in detail in the GI video on colon cancer, but I just want to mention here that in this syndrome, people have gene mutations in DNA mismatch repair proteins. They inherit a germline mutation that runs in their family, and this leads to colon cancer. That's how the disorder gets its name. But what you have to know is that women who have HNPCC or Lynch syndrome are also at risk for some gynecologic cancers. Endometrial cancer is the most common non-colon malignancy in Lynch syndrome, and these women also often develop ovarian cancer of the epithelial serous type. The most common type in all comers is also the most common type among women who have the Lynch syndrome. I'll finish by discussing CA125, which is cancer antigen 125. This is a biomarker for epithelial ovarian cancer. Basically, you can do a blood test on a woman and determine her level of CA125. And it was once thought that this might be useful for screening women. Unfortunately, CA125 has shown poor performance for screening. It is, however, useful if a woman has an adnexal mass. So if she's got a mass in her pelvis and also has a high level of CA125, that is highly suggestive of an ovarian tumor. It's also useful for monitoring response to treatment. So if a woman has a high level and then she undergoes surgery and chemotherapy, you can measure the CA125 serially to see if she's developed recurrence of her cancer. And that concludes our video on ovarian epithelial cell tumors.